surrounded by references from Lovecraft to Scott Rogers because I'm trying to find out a way to improve Milkyway Mailing Inc combat, and what I did find out is that I don't need complex mechanics, I just need better enemies. So in this video I'm going to show you 10 enemies archetypes that you can use to create enemies on your games as well, and the process that I'm following to create these enemies, because with that I already created 8 enemies for Milkyway Mailing Inc, and I'm also delegating this process to another game designer that is helping me with that because I'm quite busy working on the Godot Adventure Essentials course. So this is a course that is going to teach you how you can tell stories with games using Godot Engine. So if you're interested about it, check out the link in the description and on the pinned comment because this is a great course. But this is not the topic for this video. I'm going to talk about the 10 enemies archetypes that we can use to create enemies for our games. So let's get started. So this is the main reference I'm using, is the book Level Up by Scott Rogers, in which he presents these 10 archetypes that we are going to see in this video. So the way that we are going to unroll is that I'm going to present the archetype and some ideas on how we could implement it on Godot Engine. This is actually a video for the game designer, so he can understand the tools that we have available and can brainstorm some ideas about how we could do it. The first one is the patroller, which moves back and forth, up and down in a mechanical fashion. So this is the most common enemy type that we can think about. We can think about Koopas or something like that from Mario. The enemy just has a predictable movement path, and it repeats this path forever or until something interferes in his movement. So we also call this enemy a wanderer because he just wanders around. The way that I would implement that in Godot Engine is using a path 2D with a path follow 2D as its children, and use a ping pong animation animating the unit offset from the path follow node. This way, as soon as the enemy reaches the end of the path, it will move back to the beginning in this loop forever or until players like get close, and I could use something like an arrow 2D to detect if players are close enough, and this will trigger the attack pattern. So this could be something like a melee attack, but once players get out of the enemy, this patroller path, I think that it will just go back to this patrolling behavior. So this is how I would implement this one. And the next one is the chaser. So a chaser pursues the player if they are approached or some other condition is met. In many games, patrollers can turn into chasers when they see the player or the player attacks them. So the way that I would implement that in Godot Engine is by using an area or an area 2D to represent the enemy sight area. And as soon as the player gets inside this area, I would cast a shape towards the player, something like a raycast, to see if there is something obstructing the enemy's view, the enemy's sight. And this way I could play with some stealth mechanics, especially if I want this enemy to deal a lot of damage with a single hit, making so that players don't have the incentive to directly confront them. And the next one is the shooter. So according to Scott Rogers, a shooter is an enemy that fires a projectile. Pretty obvious, right? Shooting patrollers and chasers will fire at the player once they've been spotted. So we can use something like an area or an area 2D into the games to represent the enemy's sight area, and once players get inside this area, they will start the shooting behavior, just like the chaser, just like I said in the chaser previously. Due to the nature of the attack, the enemy will try to keep distance between itself and the player rather than engaging them. This is an important trait of the shooter. So the way that I would implement the shooting behavior is using a spawner that will create instances of bullets. So if you don't know how spawners work, I will suggest you to watch this video. This is a fundamental video because you have to master the 3 I's of game development: input, interaction, and instancing. And a spawner helps you solve the instancing part. So I would use a spawner to create instances of bullets. This is my abstraction of a bullet. A bullet is nothing but a flying hitbox. So if you don't know how a hitbox works or how to implement these hitboxes on Godot Engine, I would suggest you to watch this video where I show you how you can create a basic combat system using hit and hurt boxes. This is another fundamental aspect that you should master. This is the interaction part, so in this case, a combat interaction. And this flying hitbox, which I'm calling bullet, will fly towards a given direction at a given speed. And to tell the direction in which it should fly, I will use another node that will be a node 2D that will that will use its global rotation to tell the bullet the direction in which it should fly. So let me make this instead. I will bundle all these components into a single file, into a single asset, and I will share with you in a post. At the bottom of the post, you find a subscription form so that you can subscribe for my mailing list, in which I'm going to share some tips and tricks for game development in Godot Engine. So don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss this content. Now for the second behavior, which is the most interesting one to me, the one that will try to make the shooter keep a distance from the player, I will use a node 2D, let's call a distance keeper. I will use a node 2D that will take a target and it will return a normalized vector that will be the direction towards this target, but not just the direction, but it will also take a distance, a threshold distance that this node should take into account to keep a distance from the target, which in this case would be the player. So as the target gets away, it would increase this normalized vector, or this could be a movement vector, a velocity vector or something like this. And as this target moves away, it would increase the velocity, the speed towards this target. And as this target gets closer, it would decrease, it would slow down its movement up to a given point, up to a given distance. And from this distance closer, it will start to move away from this target. So I think that we can use something like an avoid steering behavior for that. I think that this would be the approach that I would take in this case. Next up, we have the guard, which is an enemy whose AI priority is to guard an item or location, like a doorway, rather than actively pursuing the player. This is an interesting behavior to keep in mind, the idea of having AI priorities, right? And the guard behavior can be easily combined with chasing or shooting if the player manages to steal the item or get past the guard. So the way that I would implement a guard is adding, of course, an array 2D to detect if the player is inside its sight area, but I will also link this behavior with another array 2D guarding the object itself or the location itself. So not only the guard would look for if player is inside its area of sight, but if player is inside its area of sight and inside the location or the object that it's guarding. So if players are just inside its sight area, nothing would happen. But if both, it is inside its sight area, and also I would use something like a raycast, just like I said in the chaser, to detect if players are hiding behind a given object that is obstructing the guard's sight. But if these three conditions are met, the player is inside the sight area, nothing is obstructing the enemy sight, and players are also inside the location that, or the object area that this guard is guarding, protecting, I will then activate is attacking behavior. So this is the way that I would use to prioritize the idea that the guard is not actively looking forward to pursue the player, but it's protecting something. It's protecting a location or an object. So this is the way that I would implement this behavior. And then we have the flyers, which according to Scott Rogers is an enemy that, well, flies. But this one I will contest its obvious statement, because this is not the major trait of a flyer. But let's keep going. They are aerial patrollers, but because they are flying, this adds another dimension to the movement. And this is, to me, the major feature, the major trait of a flyer. This book is written thinking in terms of side-scrollers. So when you think in terms of side-scrollers, players are moving horizontally towards the end of the level, and when you add a flyer, this will add another dimension to the player's movement, because they will have to jump, to hit, to attack the flyer. But not only that, I think that what defines better the flyer is that it has an unpredictable movement set. So as you can see, flyers can swoop down to attack players and so on and so forth. Scott Rogers will say that they are very advanced enemies, but because they have an advanced movement and attack pattern, they are difficult for players to predict. And I think that this is the major feature of a flyer. They have a erratic movement, so they are kind of hard to predict. In my game, the saucers are a mix of a shooter and a flyer. So they fly randomly and they also shoot randomly. So this is the mix that I made for the saucers of my game. And this is the thing about archetypes. The idea is that you can mix and match them to create enemies that fills the purpose of your game. But let's keep going. And to implement a flyer in Godot Engine, I think that I would follow the previous implementations for chaser or for a shooter, but this time I will not add another raycast to detect if its sight area is obstructed, because since it's looking from top to bottom, I think that this will give it an advantage. So it doesn't have to look if there is something obstructing its view because it's looking from top to bottom. And once players get inside its sight area, I think that I would implement an attack pattern that resembles a birds of prey attack. So they would dive towards the player's direction, especially let's think in terms of a top-down shooter now. So they would move real quick towards the player direction, but it will overshoot the player's position. And once they get to the other side, they will dive back towards its original position, and they would keep doing that, cycling, like orbiting the player until they either get defeated or the player dies. So this is how I would implement that. And for that, I will probably use something like a state machine to manage these states, like diving, waiting, and diving again, and well, get all this attack pattern on place. Next up, we have the Bomber, which Scott Rogers defines as a flyer that attacks from above rather than from the side. Bombers are common into the games as it is often difficult for players to use 3D camera to see enemies above them. But I would change this definition completely because I think that it doesn't describe the trademark of a bomber, which is the bomb. Understand that from Scott Rogers' perspective, he's describing a bomber from a side-scroller game for a side-scroller game, and in this case, the bomber is basically an enemy that drops something vertically, right? So this it drops a bomb. Which is different from a flyer, which basically hovers the player, or has something like a birds of prey attack pattern, as I described previously. But I think that the major trait of a bomber is the bomb itself. So any enemy that has a projectile that deals an area of effect damage, or it can even be itself. So you can think about a chaser that once it gets close to the player, it deals an area of effect damage. So it doesn't need to actually hit the player. But the interesting aspect of the bomber is this area of effect damage that deals a single instance of damage, and it's typically massive damage, and players don't have to be directly hit by the projectile itself or by the enemy attack in the case of a chaser that gets close to the player and explodes itself. So I think that this is the major definition of a bomber, an enemy that has an attack that deals an area of effect damage with a single damage instance. And to implement this, I think that I will make something like use a hit area. So if you don't know how hit and hurt boxes work, again, I will recommend you to watch this video that I suggested previously. But this time around, I think that different from the bullet, which starts with its collision shape turned on, the bomb will start with its collision shape turned off, and it would only toggle it on again once it hits something or after a given time or a given event. So it starts with its collision shape disabled, and I will use something like an animation or something like that that will also use an explosion visual effect to tell the area of effect of this bomb. And once this happens, I would toggle on the collision shape again, and then I will immediately toggle it off again, so it's only a single shot, it's only a single hit on the player. And the next one is the Burrower, which is an enemy with an invulnerable state that allows it to get into an advantageous position to attack the player. The player must wait for the enemy to emerge before they can attack it. This is the best approach to define enemy archetypes because it's concrete enough so we understand what the enemy is all about, but it's also abstract enough so we can transpose it to our specific game without making this just the positions about gender. So I think that this is a genre agnostic description of this enemy archetype. So for instance, on Milkyway Mailing Inc, which is a top-down space shooter, I would implement a borrower using something like a wormhole, something like a portal to another dimension. That enemy is hidden there, and they get out of this wormhole to attack the player, especially to shoot something. I think that a mix between a borrower and a shooter sounds great. And once this enemy gets out of the wormhole, it gets vulnerable, so players can attack them, but they will get into the wormhole again and get vulnerable. So I think that this would be a good implementation for Milkyway Mailing Inc. The way that I would implement this enemy on Godot Engine is pretty simple. Is basically just disable its the hurt area collision shape once it is hidden, and enable it again once it gets out, once it's emerged from this hidden state, from this borrowed state. I think that this is the easiest one to implement because it's basically toggling on and off its collision shape based on the animation that it's currently in. The next one is the teleporter, which is an enemy that can change position around the playfield, and this adds a tricky layer of complexity for its design because you have to give a good explanation about how this teleporting works. So for instance, it teleports randomly from time to time, or will it be based on players' closeness to this enemy? So when players get real close to this enemy, it will teleport, so players will have to use something like a ranged weapon to hit this player or to hit this enemy. And why wouldn't the enemy teleport from the bullet or from whatever projectile this ranged weapon shoots? So this is something that you have to think about. How far away can this enemy teleport from its original position? What will trigger this teleporting? What's the room that we are going to give players to hit this enemy? Will it be a stun attack? Will it be a ranged weapon? Will it be a cooldown or something like that? So this is a very complex enemy to implement. But the way that I would implement, I think that this is the way that I would implement in Milkyway Mailing Inc, is that it doesn't instantly teleports. So it will have something like an animation that will open a wormhole and it will teleport around a given area, especially close to the player, so around the player. And I think that I will use something that will allow it to only teleport up to a distance from its original position. So it will teleport around the player, but taking into account its original position. So if players get very far away from its original position when it starts its teleporting pattern, it will basically teleport back to its original position. So it's kind of like a chaser or something like that, because otherwise I don't find a good way to trigger this teleporter and to make it really balanced out with players. And then we also have the blocker, which is an enemy that defends itself against the player's attack with a shield or other defensive device. And I think that blockers are one of the funnest enemies archetypes to play with because you can use it as a mechanic as well. So think about it. You have a blocker that reflects the bullets back to the player, right? So it defends itself from the player's projectiles and they can reflect it back to the players, because otherwise if you just have a blocker that turns a shield on and off, this can fit more into the archetype of a borrower than a blocker. But if you have something that will reflect the bullet back to the player and deal damage to the player if they shoot directly the blocker, this can start to be more interesting. This can start to fit more into the blocker archetype. And you can play with something like using the blocker as a mechanic to hit another enemy. So let's say you have a shooter or a borrower that will hide itself once players get too close to it, and instead of directly hitting the borrower, you can bounce your bullets off a blocker shield to hit the borrower, because the borrower will not detect that the player is close to it, but it will get hit by the bounced off bullet from the blocker. And the way that I would implement that is, if I want to reflect the bullet back to the player, I will use the vector2.reflect method. So once the bullet hits the shield would be something like an arrow 2D. This arrow 2D will detect this bullet and it will change its movement vector using this vector2.reflect method, so it bounces, so it reflects back to the player, and this would make it so that it will deal damage to the player. And if I want to bounce off to use this blocker as a cool mechanic to play with, I will use the vector2.bounce method to create this pattern here, this trajectory, where the bullet hits the shield and it bounces off the shield so that it can hit other enemies. I think that this can be a really cool mechanic to play with. And finally, we have the Doppelgangers, which are enemies that look like the player and have moves, attacks, and uses an AI to mimic the player's behavior. Doppelgangers enemies force the players to use moves or weapons in an unusual manner in order to defeat themselves. So Doppelgangers are really interesting enemies to design, because especially if you think about the implementation details, how will you create a good architecture so that you can create some modules and components that you can reuse on an enemy and the player. So the player and the enemy share some code components that will create basically the same structure with the same move set, but one will be triggered by a player's input and the other one would be triggered by AI inputs, some sort of virtual input. So you can think about having an input buffer to store some players' behavior patterns to mimic them on this doppelganger. So on top of having the same move set from the player, it not only has the same move set, but it will also behave like the player. It can adapt itself to mimic the player's play style, making it so that they will copy not only the player's move set, but it will also copy the player's personality. So players will have to innovate to defeat this enemy. They will have to change their very play style to defeat this doppelganger enemy. This can be a really interesting enemy to play with. The way that I would implement that, especially to mimic the player's playstyle, is to have something like an input buffer that stores some behavior patterns from the player and have these enemies replicate these behavior patterns themselves. And now to the process I'm following to design enemies for Milkyway Mailing Inc. So on top of mixing and matching these archetypes that we just saw, I'm also taking into account what is the role of the enemy in the game. So for that, I created 3 roles for my enemies, and they can only have one out of these 3 roles. So they can be an ectric enemy, a conflict enemy, or a progress enemy. So let me explain how this works. So if they are an ectric enemy, they are there to slow down the player's pace into achieving a given goal. They're not mandatory unless, well, they are the very goal themselves, but players can basically just ignore them. But the idea is that players will get sidetracked into defeating this enemy on the journey into achieving the quest goal. So the idea is that they will be attracted by these enemies into fighting these enemies before they actually complete the quest. The conflict enemy is very close, or they are guarding, protecting the quest goal itself. It can be a location or a treasure. So you already understand that they are typically guards, right? So players can find out a way around these enemies and get to the given quest location or the given quest item or NPC or goal, whatever goal it is. But the idea is that the enemy will get out of its way to prevent players from actually complete the quest, but players can also ignore them. Progress enemies are the only ones that are mandatory. Players will have to defeat them in order to progress towards the end of the game. So these are the bosses of my games. The way that I decided to use that is that after I decided the role, I will pick 1 or 2 of these archetypes, mix them, and then I will contextualize this enemy into a given place in the game itself. So in my game, for instance, each one of these zodiac signs, which are the bosses, is have the boss pit into a given planet, and based on that I have some themes for each planet based on the zodiac sign traits. So for instance, if a given enemy is within the Mars orb, so they are minions of Aries, they are going to be explosive enemies, typically bombers. So if they are like something from Scorpio, they will be stealth enemies, probably something like borrowers or something like that will hide themselves. to get some invulnerable state, just like a Scorpio will be hidden until they can sting the player, right? And this is what I recommend you guys to do. Choose one of these 3 major roles that these enemies can have in your game. Then you decide 1, 2, maybe 3 archetypes to mix, and then you contextualize them into the place that you want them to be. So for instance, if you have a forest level, you can contextualize a guard or a blocker in the context of a forest. If you are using them into a mushroom kingdom, you will contextualize them into this mushroom kingdom, using some aesthetics to communicate this context. And that's it. But before you close this video, I would suggest you to watch this one, the hit and hurt boxes video, because this is the bread and butter of any combat system. Without that, you can't implement any of the enemies we just saw. But that said, don't forget to subscribe for my mailing list. The link will be in the description and in the pinned comment. Thank you so much for watching, keep developing, and until the next time, see you there.